Honestly, the first time that we talked about the trip, I was just like, El Salvador, January, sounds like a good vacation. Um, so I know that other people on the trip were really excited for various reasons. We had some people who are very much scholars of Oscar Romero's work, who talk a lot about liberation theology. But for me, it really started off as, this sounds like it's going to be just a good trip. And it actually took into the first day or two of the trip when I kind of realized, like, oh, you know, this is going to be a lot more than just a nice little Latin American vacation for the first part of the year. And I think out of that, I knew about some of the movements that have happened, some of the theology. I have heard of Romero. I had studied him in a class in my undergrad. But I intentionally kind of let myself be a little bit ignorant of what was happening so that when I got there, it would be even more of a profound experience for me. It's such a foreign experience. It's the context is so different from what I'm used to as a middle class, fairly well educated young adult male in the United States of America, to go then into a context of a world that I really have not ever had experience with, and see the way that people live, and not just their day-to-day life, but almost the philosophy or the theology of who they are as individuals and as a people. Every day has a specific memory attached to it. I mean, we did so much. We were constantly going, constantly seeing different things, constantly talking to different people. But for me, the memory that is still the most vivid in my mind is standing in a garden behind the university where 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women were killed, and standing in that spot. And then, you know, half an hour after standing in that spot, looking at the pictures and seeing that, oh my goodness, this wall that I was leaning on is in these pictures. It's so easy to divorce yourself from that reality, to say, oh, this happened, you know, when I was 2 years old in another country. But being there and experiencing it brings this concrete realism, and it's just like, for me, I was just constantly getting hit by this, like, no, these are real stories, these are real people, this is how this happened. So the trip was emotional. It was extremely eye-opening, and it really does force a perspective shift, because we do come as United States citizens from a place of very strong privilege, coming into a place like that and seeing how even my actions as an individual person can affect my country, can affect the way that my country works in the world. And then again, that metaphor of the elephant and the mouse, knowing that holds so much more weight compared to an individual in El Salvador.
I went to El Salvador for several reasons. First of all, my original graduate degrees are in anthropology, so I was very interested in the culture just from that perspective. Second, I had some inkling and some knowledge of liberation theology and what it grows out of. I lived through the time periods of the civil war in El Salvador, and I remember very well the right-wing death squads and the massacres in the news, although they weren't well covered here, but they were. I remember the deaths of the 6 Jesuit priests, and I also remember the 4 American church women, and how the fact that they were Americans grabbed people's attention. And at that point, the United States, which was supporting the right-wing government, for just a hiccup in time, said, well, I don't know, maybe what they're doing down there isn't so good. And I think maybe about a month's worth of attention, to possibility that America was supporting, the wrong group of people. I remember all those things, and it was very interesting to me to go down there, and we were presented not with just one side of the question, but we met with people who talked about both sides. And so that was a very interesting experience for me. So I was interested in that. And then the third reason that I was interested in is because of all the recent immigration of young children from El Salvador being sent, often unaccompanied, to come to the United States. And so we've had this conflict at our borders over whether or not to allow these children in, and why are they coming here, and what can we do about it, et cetera, et cetera. So I was very interested in that issue. And we did have some opportunities to talk about some of those issues while we were there with various people. And so those are the 3 reasons I was interested. In my future ministry, I hope to do parish ministry here in Pennsylvania for a number of years, but as you can see, I'm an older student, and at some point, my husband is going to retire from his job, and we're hoping at some point to move to California. And at that point, I thought perhaps I could be involved in ministry to immigrants in Southern California. So this is very interesting to me. So those are the 3 reasons I went, but I'll tell you, there was so much information that we were presented with and so many viewpoints that, again, like Seth, I could talk about it all day. For me, I think 3 or 4 things stand out as memorable. I think the very first and most important thing is the amazing resiliency and hopefulness of the Salvadoran people, which is very much fed by their faith, I think. But it's striking to me that the faith, the Christian faith in all its different manifestations is present in people both who were oppressed and people who were the oppressors. So that's an interesting dynamic for me, and it's worth exploring more. And then beyond that, I think the second most memorable thing for me was the experience we had at Copapayo, which is Lake Suchitoto. And this is a site of one of the great massacres where the right-wing death squads, it was actually an army unit, came and massacred over 100 peasants who had no arms and armaments, and they were not combatants. They were mostly women, children, and elderly people. And we heard a presentation, a remembrance by one of the only survivors of that massacre, who was only 9, I think, or 10 at the time, Rogelio. And he told this story, which if I told it right now, I would break down in tears because it's just heart-wrenching, of their being rounded up and massacred, and him watching his family die, et cetera, et cetera. So that will live in my memory for a long, long time. And then the third thing that I think really, really stands out to me is that because we were presented opportunities to talk to people on both sides, from the ruling party, which is currently the FMLN, and that's the leftist party, and also from the Arena party, which ruled for many years after the Civil War. We heard representatives of both sides, and they still have diametrically opposite ideas of what went on during that time. And so it's really remarkable to me that although time marches on and history marches on and people return from exile and there was a general amnesty and peace declared, there was never anything like a truth and reconciliation kind of thing like what they did in South Africa. And so people have never come to terms with the terrible atrocities that were done. And they were done on both sides, but mostly, I think it's agreed. A UN panel has written a report that said that most of the atrocities were committed by the right-wing government at that time. But it's remarkable to me that they have not done that kind of reconciliation thing, and yet they continue to live together, and there does seem to be this sense of hopefulness about everything, and yet it feels like it could fall apart at any time. So that kind of concerns me.
That sense of hopefulness is really something that struck me in a lot of different ways, and it's just interesting because it was one of those things that just caught me off guard as a country that was so war-torn, that was so had so many bad things happen to it for so long. I never got a sense of the people wallowing in that. Mm-hmm. Like saying, oh, these horrible things happened to us and we're just never going to recover and we'll never get over it, woe is me. I never got that sense. There is this strong optimism, no matter who we were talking to. I mean, it's very realistic. People are very aware of the fact that there's horrible gang violence that still continues. There's awful disparity between the two parties. They don't seem like they talk to each other well in their governmental proceedings. There's extreme poverty. There's still a lot of socioeconomic oppression. But despite all that, no matter who we were talking to, whether it was people who were more benefiting or more oppressed, there was this optimism from everyone that we talked to that was, this is what we're going through now, this is what we've gone through in the past, and this is where we're trying to go. And it just struck me because there definitely were points where we heard some of the attacking language back and forth between the two different groups, but not to the same extent that I hear it in my context, where it seems like no matter what you hear, and especially in the media, it seems to be this person attacking this person, saying they're wrong. I didn't get that sense in El Salvador. And it might have been the people that we talked to. It might have been specifically, we're talking to these people because they do have this optimism. No, I don't know if that was intentional or not. But that's the sense that we got, that El Salvador is moving forward, that they are trying to figure out where they're going. And just seeing that and starting to ask those questions of why are they so optimistic? Why are they looking forward? And I don't know why that is, but I think it does have to do with that hopefulness, faithfulness, theological undercurrent. I mean, I can't say this is why it's happening, but it's just something that I noticed.
I periodically teach these travel seminars, we call them, in El Salvador. The seminary offers a variety of such seminars, one or more every year, to different parts of the world. This is the fourth time that we've gone to El Salvador, I believe, starting in 2001. This year we went January 13th to the 22nd, and we we organized the trip through the Center for Global Education at Augsburg College, a Lutheran school in Minnesota that has this excellent center whose sole mission is to provide global education experiences. They are not mission trips in the sense of going to do a project, build a school, that kind of thing that many people do excellent work. This is a different kind of hopefully excellent work where you go, you talk with people, you are in a place, you hear and see and experience what people are doing and what the history has been. You learn as much as you can by being there. And so they do the logistics in coordination with what we want out of the trip. And then when we are there, the trip is really, again, led by the staff member from the Center for Global Education in El Salvador, who's himself Salvadoran. He gets us where we need to go, takes care of all the details. Either he himself or someone that he hires does translation work. And then he also provides both formally and informally a great deal of his own insight and helping people when questions come up. And then I, as the instructor for the seminary, work with him on designing the program and facilitate evening discussion sections where we basically reflect upon, learn from, debrief the many experiences that we've had each day. And most days are pretty packed, usually packed with a lot of quantity of things, but almost always packed with, emotionally and spiritually, there's a lot going on. In terms of why we do it, maybe I could organize that into 3 headings and then go on and hear more importantly from students who participated. One is, I think, repeatedly in Paul's letters in the New Testament, he talks about, we have heard of your faith, or your faith has gone out into all the world, I think he says to the Thessalonians, or word of your faith has gone out into all the world. And the faith, or word of the faith of Christians in El Salvador has gone out into all the world. That's one reason why we go, that El Salvador is a pretty small country. It's geographically about the size of Massachusetts. It has between 6 and 7 million inhabitants, so it's a good deal smaller than the largest cities of this country or Latin America. But people all over the world know about, most of all about Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was killed in 1980 in El Salvador. Great many people know about Jesuit educators and a woman who worked at their university and her daughter who were killed in 1989 during a long time of armed conflict in the country. Many people in the United States know about 4 churchwomen, some nuns and some one lay church worker who were killed in 1980 in the country. So those are just the most famous names internationally of people who gave their lives in the sense of being killed, but many other people gave their lives in terms of dedicating their lives to work based upon their faith in the country, and that El Salvador has supplied a disproportionate amount of that on the international scale in recent decades. So that's one sense, well, you've heard about this, so let's go and see. As Philip, Nathaniel, the conversation, come and see. So that when we're there, then it'll no longer only be hearing at a distance, but that we will taste and touch and see the actual fabric of that faith testimony in place and hear directly from the people. A second feature is that, when you go, we go to learn about people in El Salvador and the country of El Salvador, both because of that is valuable in itself, just appreciating other people for who they are and coming to understand their situation. But there are some other features of that for us as well, I think, as seminarians from the United States. One is that in studying theology, we make a big deal here at the seminary to appreciate that theological ideas are always have a context, that they don't come from nowhere, but they respond to certain questions and certain contextual concerns. And sometimes it's hard to see your own context, because it's like a fish swimming in the water doesn't go around saying, well, the water is my context, and you don't think about the water. But so to leave your own context, in this case, to go to another country, another culture, and to see then maybe their context is more obvious to you because it's strange to you, it's different. And so you can see their questions and context and the responses, how the responses are engaged, that context and those questions. Then by kind of, backlash is the wrong word, but kind of reflexively, then you can look back at the context you have come from or that you go back to after a week and a half of being there and see it with new eyes because you've been outside it and because you've seen in another setting how theological thinking grows out of a context, that then you can think with new eyes about how your own theological thinking has grown out of a context and now in some new ways, maybe more self-conscious, in a good sense, more reflective and thoughtful ways can engage your own context constructively. So there's that element of what we get out of it for here. And I guess a third major area to note is, given the two relative contexts of the country, those countries, that is the United States and El Salvador on a global scheme, it's very important for church leaders, I think, in the United States, at least other people learn about other countries and other places, but for some to learn about El Salvador. El Salvador is, as I've already said, is a very small country in terms of geographic size and population compared to the United States. It's also a country with very little geopolitical power, economic power, military power, diplomatic power compared to the United States, but it's very close to the United States. It's Texas, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador. So people in El Salvador know exponentially more about the United States than people in the United States know about El Salvador. People in El Salvador know that Barack Obama is the president of the United States. Very few people in the United States could name the president of El Salvador, and you can multiply examples. Because it's kind of like the joke about, well, the mouse needs to know if the elephant sneezes. This elephant doesn't need to pay attention particularly to the mouse sneezing in terms of the reciprocal effect because of difference in size and power. So there's that element, but more directly there's the element, and this has been in the news a lot in the last year in this country, the number of relatively recent, that is the last several decades, immigrants from El Salvador to the United States is probably between 1/3 and 1/4 of the total population currently in El Salvador. That is, I mean, that population is there, but that's between 6 and 7 million, and there may be 2 million people in the last several decades that have come from El Salvador to the United States. So, and they, of course, they have families and friends, and they talk with them, and a major part of the Salvadoran economy is money sent back from Salvadorans in this country back to their family and friends. That's a lot of why, very much of why people risk either the long diplomatic, bureaucratic paperwork of filing for a visa to come to this country, or the very expensive and very dangerous trip to come as an immigrant illegally into this country. It's not that they're going to make a lot of money in the kind of jobs most of them get, and it's not that they're going to live a happy life far from their family and friends, but they get money that they can send back. So the consciousness of the United States and what's going on in the United States is so strong in El Salvador compared to vice versa. So to have some people from this country who are leaders and will be leaders in faith communities who understand that there is this country and something of its relation and how the actions of our country affect people in that either living in that country or trying to come to this country, is a very valuable, I think, contribution. I always say these trips, the people we go talk to, the people from the Center for Global Education that plan the trip and set it up is always great. there's just, it's wonderfully well organized to give a diverse experience, to really encounter powerful things, to hear not just one point of view, to really be immersed in a way that changes you, and that changes you because you're pushed to take responsibility and to think, well, what do I really think about this? What differences do I make for my life? So that material is always there, but obviously the people that go on from our group, they're the ones who are pushed to think and to do something, and that's up to them, to us, to respond. And certainly as an instructor, it was a great pleasure with this group. I said every night that we have a debriefing, reflection, debrief is really the wrong word, but processing what's gone on during the day. And most any time that you're leading a group that's an open-ended processing group, you're not trying to solve one particular problem, so you want to leave it pretty open, but usually someone has to start talking, and so you usually need 2 or 3 questions to prime the pump and get people going. This group, all I had to do was say, well, what did you think about today? And within 4 seconds, someone started talking, and it was not just superficial at all, and then it went until we said, okay, time to stop, that this was a really energetically, thoughtfully, vulnerably engaged group that was just an honor and a pleasure to be with. The second thing I would say in response to some of the things said here is I answered the question why we do the trips in terms of kind of institutionally, why we do them a lot as a Christian school. And if I could go back to that and take one more swipe at an element of that, I think of Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel, when she has this encounter with a man who she at first thinks is the gardener, and then just realizes, oh, she's encountering the resurrected Jesus. And she runs to tell the other disciples, and she gets there and she says that I have seen the Lord. And so in doing so, she's the first apostle, the first person sent with the resurrection message. And both with all the seminary trips and my own experience with El Salvador, that before coming to the seminary and why I'm the person that does these trips, that's to me the experience behind this. I think Seth was saying optimism, I would use the word hopefulness. The hope is, you could look at statistics a lot and say, oh, well, El Salvador has had and continues to have many, many problems. But the reality is you go and you talk to the people we talk to, you see the artwork and the murals and the crosses painted with resurrection scenes and the way people act and you realize, well, there is this amazing hopefulness, which in Christian terms I can only understand as resurrection, as the Easter side of the Good Friday that they have gone through. And continue to go through in some terrible ways. And so that part of why we go, or at least from my point of view, part of why we go on this trip is so, again, this thing about we have heard of their faith. We're not just curious, but we want the benefit, we want this contagion of faith and hope from our brothers and sisters, that they give that to us. And they say when we go also that it is, I guess the biblical word would be edifying, upbuilding. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up, that people there generously say that it builds them up, that we come, that they know that there are brothers and sisters thinking about them and that are interested in them and want to know about them. So it's a real reality of the Spirit working through the bonds of community to build up faith and hope that say we read about in the Bible and then we live it on a trip like this. Then I wanted to add one thing just to what I was saying at the beginning about the importance, particularly of people in the United States going to El Salvador. I talked about a lot in terms of power disparities and needing to know something about this other country. And this was touched upon in, I think, some of what Sharon was saying, but it's not just a power disparity, it's also the case that in that the United States has for a long time been heavily present, is heavily present economically, politically in El Salvador, and during the late 70s through the early 90s, the time of open armed conflict in that country, that and the turmoil leading up to that, that the United States was backing the government and the kind of ruling powers in that country, so that I have a poster in my office that I almost brought over here, but I think it won't show up well on the camera. That's a poster that was done shortly after the Jesuit University murders in 1989 happened. There was a national religious coalition called National Debate for Peace, ecumenical group that the Lutheran Church of El Salvador and others were involved in. And it had a picture of a hand that's like the hand of the crucified Jesus, a hand with a blood stain in the middle, and then some blood on the wall that Seth was talking about in the garden behind the university where the Jesuits were killed. And it had the names of the 8 people killed in that murder, and they had bullet casings on the ground, and they all say "Made in USA" and that's just historical fact. That a lot of training of the officers that led that particular battalion that was involved in killing the Jesuits and in the massacre at Copapayo that Sharon was talking about, were trained in the United States, and military supplies under both Democratic and Republican administrations from this country. So it's not an abstract thing that there's this powerful neighbor to the north, but the United States has been heavily involved, and often in ways that were very detrimental to people there. Archbishop Romero is famous and now been declared a martyr of the Catholic Church, and will probably be officially declared a saint before too long, it looks like. But one of the things that he did, this was under Democratic U.S. administration when President Carter was president, but he wrote a letter which he read to the cathedral congregation in El Salvador after he sent it, but wrote a letter to President Carter and said, your government, please stop sending this money to the government in El Salvador, because I don't know what may have good intentions for what it's doing, but in effect, it's ending up killing people here. So for people in the United States to learn a little more of that history, and if I can take a little more time and the story to tell the story that brings that home to me, how little knowledge we have here. In the 2004 vice presidential debates, and that between Dick Cheney and John Edwards it was, and Vice President at the time Cheney defending U.S. policies at the time in Iraq and saying, well, this military presence is important in order to open up space and security for people to have free elections. Certainly a noble goal. But he used as a historical reference how the United States was militarily involved, a presence, not troops on the ground, but advisors and military support and all in El Salvador during their armed conflict in order to facilitate people coming to elections and not being scared away by armed forces. The open historical record, as referred to a little from the UN report that Sharon cited, is the overwhelming amount of armed forces scaring away people from voting was done by the very people the United States government was supporting. I don't mean here to be criticizing the Republicans or President Cheney specifically, because my real concern was then John Edwards as the Democratic candidate, who you would assume would want to make debating points against Cheney, could have said, well, Mr. Vice President, if you read the UN report, you're just reversing the history. The people that were barring free elections was the military dictatorship and death squads of out of uniform military, run by the military and the government and so forth. But he didn't. He said nothing. He went on to the next point because he knew nothing. He's running for vice president, and he simply knew nothing about the recent history of the United States in El Salvador. that level of ignorance, is a dangerous thing. So it's really good to have people who know something, who are leaders in this country, who know something about the United States in relation to El Salvador in its recent past and an ongoing present. The participants obviously bear the main brunt of the funding. There are a lot of people who believe in these trips happening, a lot of organizations, and they all, organizations and individual people, and I want to name ones that were directly involved here. The seminary itself, I said there's a travel seminar. It's part of the curriculum of the school, and you can meet certain requirements for your degree program by going on this trip and do a project associated with it. And so if you do take the course for credit, you pay half of the normal tuition rate because the school knows you have to pay all this money to do airfare and for logistics in country. So the school only collects half the normal tuition. That's one thing. A second thing, Dorothy Marple, known to many people at this seminary, a great leader of the church, the Lutheran Church in the United States in the second half of the 20th century, and who died just pretty recently, last several years. She left a generous bequest in her estate for money for ecumenical education in the 3 Lutheran seminaries of the so-called Eastern Cluster. So our seminary, the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg, and the Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary in South Carolina. And so some of that money is divided up, and a portion goes to each school each year, or if we have joint projects, we can do something between the schools. But a chunk of that money, through the generosity of our dean, I asked, and I said, well, because this trip satisfies ecumenical requirement of the school. We met with the Lutheran bishop, we met with we met with Catholic sisters and lots of Catholic lay people there. And so some money from the Dorothy Marple Ecumenical Fund supported this trip. And it's good to think of her, the amazing person that she was, as we were on this trip. We also, as you can imagine, any trip like this, there are economies of scale. If you get more people going, then a lot of the specific costs are less, because you have, you might have fit 2 more people in the same van, so the cost goes down. The Center for Global Education, who, as I said, did the logistics of the trip, when they saw that we had enough people to go, but we had 8 students plus myself, so it wasn't a large group, so the cost was still relatively high. They said, well, we'll reduce some of the money we make off the trip, and they cut a sizable chunk off the normal per person cost that they had quoted at the beginning of the planning once we got deep into it and they saw where we were. And even our travel agent, we used a travel agency that's a Mennonite travel agency, and we got good airfare rates, but at one point we had even cheaper airfare rates than the ones we ended up with, and we put in the reservation. We just had to confirm with people's passport numbers in 24 hours, and by the time we got back, the rate had gone up some, and he wasn't able to keep the rate that we had made the provisional booking on. And he felt, again, enough desire to support this trip that he reduced some of his the travel agency fee he reduced so the students would have to pay less for their trip. So it's really a remarkable contribution of a lot of people in different places, some of whom have never even seen any of us face to face, but said, this is important what you're doing and I want to keep the cost down.
I think the current immigration situation in California that we're all upset about is a prime example. We talked about it among a number of the speakers that spoke to us. We asked these questions, and what resonated with me was, how could anything be so terrible that a woman would send her unaccompanied child, 7, 8, 9 years old, to cross all those countries to get to the Mexican border to get into the United States? Who would do that? What mother would do that? What could be so bad? And so that was my real question. And of course what it is that these gangs that have taken over great sections of San Salvador and are, they're extracting what they call la renta, right? This is, they're extorting money from businesses to the extent that over 10% of any given business's what is it, proceeds or their capital has to be tied up in security. And there are men with machine guns in front of probably 7 or 8 businesses on any given block. And this is to keep these gangs at bay. And the gangs haven't taken over everything yet, but they're a very, very real danger to these businesses. And in the areas that they do actually control, where you can't even get a taxi to take you into those areas. We asked our host, you know, at our first day there when we were fairly naive, some folks thought about taking a taxi and going out on the town and asked if there are places that we shouldn't go. And he said, oh, don't worry about that, because any place you shouldn't go, a taxi will not take you. That's how dangerous they are. And they go into schools and take children and say, you know, Freddie works for me today. Some of these gangs are involved in drugs, but it's mostly extortion rackets. It's about territories. And where do these gangs come from? They come from Los Angeles. These are El Salvadorans who were either refugees at some point from the Civil War, or they were, you know, illegal immigrants at some point and got in trouble in California, went to prison, learned all about how to run a gang, and when they got out, they were what's the word? Deported back to El Salvador. They started up the gangs. The gangs actually have the names of street gangs in Los Angeles. They're named after streets in Los Angeles. And so these are the gangs that are running extortion rackets in San Salvador and making lives so dangerous for children that a mother would rather send her unaccompanied 9-year-old or 7 or 8-year-old to walk by themselves to California than to keep them there, because they're afraid they will be killed, you know, in one kind of violence or another. Now, that's just one tip of the iceberg, because it's this whole web of nastiness. The security in San Salvador, which is it's a $1 or billion-dollar business, who's that run by? It's the 14 or so families that have always had all the money in El Salvador. They are running the security business, so they're making lots of money off of, you know, securing these businesses for the people who are afraid of the gangs. So there's a kind of a double standard there. There's a, you know, on the one hand, nobody wants the gangs, but on the other hand, you're making lots of money off of security. So that kind of creates a conflict of interest there. So that's another thing. And the third thing that really stands out to me is where do these gangs get their power? The guns come from America, all of them. When I asked the representative from FMLN, how would we stop this from happening, he said we could stop it tomorrow. The United States could stop it tomorrow by stopping the flow of guns across the border. And yet we're pulling our hair out and saying, how do we stop this? And it's really comes all back to our door. So for me, one of the biggest things that this does to me, for me, and it really probably, you know, I've always had a passion for social justice, but this really, really has energized me to think that, you know, we really need to do some things in this country, not only for ourselves, but for all the other people around the world that we are damaging by some of our misguided policies. The great socioeconomic divide that exists in El Salvador exists here too. And it makes me reflect on my own country. You know, one hopes that never will there be a war like that in this country, but it makes me wonder, you know, the more that some people have and the less that most of us have, makes me wonder whether at some point there might be exactly that kind of a conflict that breaks out between the haves and the have-nots. And it's really striking to see it up close and personal, as we did on that trip.
We always try to meet with Bishop Medano Gomez of the Lutheran Church and sometimes some other leaders of that church. Because, and to talk about it briefly in this interview, since they're a partner of ours, they're in the Lutheran World Federation with us. Bishop Gomez has been on campus, he's preached in our chapel, he's talked at lunch with students and others here. And he will, a little later in the semester, at one of our major Wednesday Eucharistic celebrations in the chapel, this group will present to President Los of the seminary across from the cathedral church where Bishop Gomez is the pastor, Resurrection Lutheran Church in San Salvador, a smaller replica of a cross that they have in their sanctuary presented to the seminary here as a further symbolic connecting of us in the Lutheran strand of the tree of the Christian church worldwide. But one of the things that's hope-giving, again, to go back to the theme that both Seth and Sharon were raising, hope-giving about going to El Salvador as a Lutheran, is this little Lutheran church that's a very distinct minority in the country. It's a small part of the Christian population, and the overall population, and relatively new. It was just begun in the late 1950s. But what's very moving is how many people in the country identify with the Lutheran Church, way beyond people who are officially members of the church. You know, that if we have church events here, often you have an event of your congregation or your synod or your group of congregations, and you figure what fraction of the membership will come. Well, they have events, and there are all these people who come who aren't even in the church, aren't even officially in the Lutheran Church, because they say, well, actually I'm not, or I'm Roman Catholic, or I'm this. But I think the Lutheran Church is my church too, because of the witness that the Lutheran Church has given, because of the work that the Lutheran Church has done, because of the way the church has lived out its faith, that people say, well, they have embraced me, they have embraced us, they have embraced my community, so they're also my church. And they come and they celebrate the annual kind of synodical, Lutheran Church synodical birthday event, which is the anniversary of Bishop Gomez becoming a bishop, and there's this tremendous goodwill toward the Lutheran Church there that is a model for the rest of the world. I think if you could meet people on the street in the United States or other countries that would say the laudatory, enthusiastic things that people in El Salvador say about the Lutheran Church, just unprompted, that's a good thing to live toward for us in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and many other Lutheran churches around the world.
Face the realities of what oppression exists in the world and how one can come through that and come out of it and still be hopeful and trust in your faith to bring you through that. I think it has a very real purpose for people who are interested in theology and interested in ministry to see what this kind of experience can do to a nation and a people, and how they can still be a hopeful and forward-looking people. Fueled by their faith, I think, is a very important thing.
Some of the ways that I learn to understand my own faith is by finding exemplary models in other people. So exactly like Sharon just said, I'm still processing and I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this trip will shape me in the future and is continuing to shape me now. But I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that this 9 days in January shifted my perspective on my life and on my faith. Mm-hmm. Some of those perspective changes may not really flower for years, But I definitely, there's no question in my mind that this definitely has been a life-changing experience for me. And for anybody that would be wanting an experience like that, absolutely, like, do it.